Hey guys, in this video, you will learn more about how to use parameters in your functions. In the previous video, I explained the concept of what a function is. If you have not watched that video, I suggest you first watch that particular video to get a better understanding of functions and then to see how we can make use of parameters in our functions. Just a quick recap. This is our block of code, which is our function, which is step one, writing the function, and then step two is calling up the function using its name. So that's what functions are all about. You can call it multiple times, and here I called that particular function twice. So that would execute this code 2 times. Now, what is a parameter? Well, a parameter is used to bring a value into the function. If you look at this particular function, we have 3 print statements, but these print statements are fixed. They are fixed, meaning every time I call this display function, it will always print, "Hello, Tigger, how are you?" The output that's going to be displayed is always fixed. It will never change every time I call the display function. So through the use of parameters, it gives us a bit more flexibility. And you will see just now how it can be more flexible. This is the one that I just discussed. That is the function. And here the function is called twice. Now look at this particular function, very similar to our previous function, except that we now have something here. And this is called our parameter. So we said that a parameter is used to bring in a value into the function, right? So parameter brings in a value into the function. So we are bringing in a value into this function, and we are using the parameter, and the parameter is called name. So this parameter, think of it as being similar to a variable, and it holds a value. So this is similar to a variable, and it will have a value. Remember that a parameter brings in a value. So this will store that value. The value that I'm bringing in will be stored in this parameter called name. So that's the one difference. And here, when I print, whatever value I'm coming in with here, that is what is going to be displayed there. Unlike when I printed a name here, I always printed Tigger. That was fixed. That was fixed. This is now more flexible because I bring in a value that's stored in the parameter name, and then I display whatever is stored in name. That is going to be fixed, and that will be fixed. But this name is going to be flexible. So you're possibly thinking, you are bringing in a value. How do you send the value into the function? Because that's ultimately what's happening. How do I send the value? So how do I send the value into this function? Now that happens when the function is being called. So this is it's an extremely nice way of writing your functions. Notice I'm calling display. So that is the function call display. And now this is called an argument. So that's the argument. And that is your parameter. So the value of the argument is sent. The value of this argument is sent to your parameter. So I've got Winnie. That's the value. Winnie is being sent to my parameter, and Winnie is now stored in this parameter called name. So when I execute the statements, it's going to say hello. When I say print name, this Winnie is stored in name, so it's actually going to print Winnie at that stage. And then it's going to print, how are you? So when I call this function and the argument value is Winnie in this case, then Winnie gets displayed. Look at the next call of the function. I'm now calling the same function, but this time round, I'm calling it with Simon. So the argument is called Simon. So this value is now sent to the parameter name. So now name has the value Simon. And when you have, it's going to come and display hello. And then when you printing the name, it's going to print the value in the parameter name, which is Simon. So I hope you can see that through the use of a parameter, the block of code, your function, becomes a lot more flexible in how we call it. So I could call it in many different ways. I could then say display, and I could then give it some other value. In this case, let's call it Tigger. So this time around, Tigger gets displayed. Whatever value you put as your parameter, that value will then be, that argument is then assigned to the parameter name, and that gets printed at this line here. Now, just a couple of things to take note of. I called the parameter name. It could be called anything. You could have called this parameter X for that matter. You could have called it X. And then you could have said print X. It's just a name, and you could call it any name you want to. But make sure you follow the rules of variables. Don't start with a number or leave spaces. So you could have any name that you want to for your parameter. Then the other thing you should also take note of is there's nothing stopping me from having a variable. So let's assume I've got ans equals, and I give that some name called Tim. And then I call display. I'm calling my function, and I call it with ans. So I'm not calling it with a string value like I did with the others. Here I'm calling it with a variable. But this variable is actually a string value. So there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that when I use the argument ans, and ans has the value Tim, Tim is actually going to be sent to this parameter called name. And when I display name, it's actually going to display Tim in this case. So it's all about when you call the function, what value are you sending in for the parameter to receive? And when the parameter receives it, you can then utilize that value inside of the function. So it's a lot more flexible, it's a lot more powerful compared to this particular example where if I call this function 50 times, it's the values that I am displaying 50 times are fixed each time I call the function. So take note that we have, by using parameters, it makes our programming code more flexible, exactly the way I explained it to you. And also take note of what is your parameter and what is your argument. The argument is when you are calling the function. It's the value that you're sending in. And the parameter is when you're defining the function. It's the value that's receiving, the one that receives the value. It's all about sending and receiving. That's what parameters and arguments are. right? So the argument is the sender and the parameter is the receiver of the value. Keep that in mind. Here's another example. Let's look at this particular example here. And there's my block of code. That's my one block called display. And here I'm calling display and I'm sending in the argument Tigger. So Tigger, when I run the program, remember, if I had to start this program, Python will ignore this block. And at this stage, it calls the function and it sends the value Tigger. So the parameter name has the value Tigger. It's going to print hello, Tigger, how are you? And it's then going to go back to where it came from. And it goes to the next statement. In the next statement, Winnie is assigned to the variable name. I then call the function again with name, and name has the value Winnie. So Winnie is sent up to name. So name has the value Winnie, and it's going to print hello, Winnie, how are you? And then it's going to come back here, and there's no other statements to execute. So this is how we would use the functions. Let's do a quick demo in terms of how this would work in the Python environment. So again, let's go. Let me write a different type of function this time. So I'm defining my function, and here I'm going to call it process. So that's my function, and I am going to not use any parameters to start off with, right? And I'm going to have an input statement. So I'm going to say num equals, let's input a number, enter a number. Remember that we are inputting a number, we're converting that number into an integer, and I'm storing it into an integer variable. Let's check that variable. If num is greater than 10, then let's print a message to say number is greater than 10. Else, I want to print number is, let's put this in caps, not greater than 10. So now you will see that this particular function does not just have print statements like the other ones that I've used. I've got input statements and I've also got some checks in it. And remember that that function is useless unless I call it. Process is the name of the function, and I am now calling the function. So let's give that a run. And there we are. It asks me to enter a number. If I enter the number 20, it then says number is greater than 10. So you will see that this function is executing when that procedure is called. Now let's look at how we can possibly make this function a bit more flexible through the use of parameters. So I am now going to take out this input statement from there, and I'm moving it here. I'll explain this more clearly to you just now. And in here, I am putting a parameter called num. So I am receiving, this is my parameter num. I'm receiving a value, and in here, I'm checking that value if it's greater than 10, and then I display whether it is greater than 10 or not. And At line number 9, I'm inputting a number, and I then send, that's my argument, I'm now sending in this number that I've input into my function process. So I wonder how this would now work. Well, if I think about this, you need to understand that this is your function. So that's your block of code. And when Python needs to execute the code, it will ignore this block of code. It does not execute that block of code. And it's going to start, it's actually going to start running the code from this point here. It's going to come to line number 9, and that is where it's first going to execute the code. Then it's going to go to line number 10. And at line number 10, you are calling this particular function process. And we are sending in the value of num. Remember, num would have gotten a value that you would have input. And that value is now the argument that sends its value to the parameter num. So if I enter the value 6, if num has the value 6, then 6 is carried forward up to this parameter here, and then you're testing if 6 is greater than 10, which is false. It goes to the else, and it's going to say number is not greater than 10. So this is how the function is now going to work. It does not have an input inside the function. The input is outside the function, and the value is now sent into the function for processing. Let's give this a run, and let's see how that is going to work. There we are. It's asking me to enter a number. Remember, it would have ignored that, and enter a number is actually coming from line number 9, where it's asking me to enter the number. When I type in the number, then that value, the function is going to be called with that value. So let's enter a number 6, and the function is called, and it's going to say number is not greater than 10. Similarly, if I want this to execute many times, let's say I want to do this 3 times, so I'm going to go for x in range 1, 4. So it runs 3 times, and I'm going to put these 2 statements inside of the for loop. So that means that now we've got there's the for loop. Each time I'm going to request the user to enter a number, and I've got the function that's going to be called inside of the for loop. Multiple times. It gets a number, sends the number, calling it into the function. Whatever number I enter, that number is processed, and it comes back. Because it's inside of a loop, it comes back and enters a second number, and that number then goes to the function and executes. It comes back because it's still in a loop, enters another number, and calls the function for a 3rd time with the new value. So let's see how this works. If I give it a run, this is now the for loop. X is 1 at this stage, right? So let's leave it there. So remember, at line 9, right, the for loop would have executed. Now we are waiting at line 10. I enter the value 20, and then line 11 is going to call the function, and it says the number is greater than 10. 20 would have come in here, and it would have tested it, and it's saying number is greater than 10. It's now saying enter a number because it would have come back to line 9, and the loop would have been 2, and it's asking us to enter a second number. So let's enter the number 8, and the function at line 11 is called again with 8 going to the top, and this time around it's telling us it's not greater than 10. And it comes back because the loop has to run 3 times. It's asking me to enter a number. So this time I'm going to go 50. It's going to call the function again. And guess what? It's now ended the program. The program has now ended because this loop has now executed 3 times. And in the process, the function was called 3 times. It had an argument num, and that was the number that we were inputting. So here you'll notice that the argument and the parameter have the same names. They have the same names. You can keep them the same, or you can use something different. For example, let's assume I had number. Then here I would have said number. So my argument is called number, and the parameter is called num. The value of number, whatever number is, that will be transferred to num, and then that value of num is going to be checked. You have to practice this to understand it better, so give it a try. I hope it gives you a better understanding of how functions work with parameters. Thank you. Until the next video. Goodbye.